rode before the storm, long before the snow swallowed him whole, before the wilderness claimed his name like a whispered secret. There was the rhythm of the road, a steady hum beneath the tires, the crackle of the CB radio, cutting through the silence, and the scent of black coffee and diesel fumes clinging to the air. His name was Harold Thompson, but to the men who shared the highways with him, he was just Hank, a man who knew the weight of a loaded trailer like the back of his calloused hand. The truck stops were his second home, where the glow of neon signs flickered against the twilight, and the clatter of ceramic mugs against formica tables marked the passage of time. He'd slide into a booth, order a plate of eggs, over easy with a side of toast, and listen to the stories of fellow drivers, men who spoke in the shorthand of mile markers and weather warnings, their voices rough with exhaustion, but warm with camaraderie. Hank had his routines, the small rituals that kept the loneliness at bay. A quick check of the engine before dawn, the way he'd tap the dashboard twice for luck, the worn photograph of his wife tucked behind the sun visor. He knew the routes like verses of a song, the curves where the headlights would catch the eyes of deer frozen in the underbrush, the stretches where the radio signal dissolved into static. But on that October evening in 1983, something was different. The air carried a bite, sharp and unrelenting, and the weather report crackling over the radio wasn't just background noise. It was a warning. Severe winter storm moving in fast, whiteout conditions expected by midnight, travel not advised. The words lingered in his mind, heavy as the clouds gathering on the horizon. He should have pulled over, should have listened to the tightness in his gut, the way his fingers drummed against the steering wheel just a little too fast. But deadlines were deadlines, and Hank had never missed one. The dispatch had been clear: get the load to Billings by morning, no excuses. So he adjusted his cap, took a long swig of coffee, gone cold, and rolled the rig back onto the highway. The first flakes began to fall as he passed the last truck stop. Delicate, at first, then thicker, swirling in the headlights like ghosts. The road ahead stretched into darkness, the trees lining the highway standing sentinel, their branches swaying as if whispering a caution he couldn't quite hear. And then the storm hit. Not with a roar, but with a suffocating silence, the kind that makes a man lean forward in his seat, squinting against the white wall descending around him. The wind howled, a sound that wasn't just in the air, but inside the cab, inside his bones. The wheel fought against his grip, the truck groaning as it crawled forward, blind. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf's cry cut through the gale, sharp and wild. Hank's breath came faster, shallow puffs of steam in the frigid air. He told himself it was just another haul, just another night on the road. But deep down, he knew the storm wasn't just weather. It was an omen. And the woods were watching, waiting, hungry. The night of December 12th, 1983, did not begin with the howl of the wind. It began with silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against the cab of his Freightliner like a warning. He had heard the forecasts, the crackling voices over the CB radio, speaking of a storm rolling in from the north, a beast of ice and fury. But deadlines were deadlines, and the roads were still open, just barely. So he shifted into gear, the diesel engine growling beneath him, as the first flakes began to fall, lazy and deceptive, melting against the warmth of his hood. By the time he hit the back roads of northern Michigan, the storm had shed its pretense of gentleness. The wind came in waves now, slamming against the truck, with the force of an ocean tide, each gust threatening to nudge him toward the ditch. His knuckles whitened around the wheel, the vinyl cracked with age beneath his grip. The wipers fought a losing battle, their rhythmic squeak the only sound cutting through the roar of the gale. Through the streaked glass, the world had dissolved into a swirling void. No horizon, no road lines, just the occasional ghostly flicker of a reflector post, swallowed again by the whiteout before he could be sure it was even there. The cold was creeping in. He cranked the heat, but the vents only coughed out lukewarm air. the engine struggling against the strain of the storm. His breath fogged the cabin, and he wiped at the glass with a gloved hand, only for the condensation to return moments later. The CB radio hissed static, the voices of other drivers long since faded into the storm's scream. He was alone, not just in the cab, not just on the road, but in a way that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, a loneliness that whispered of things beyond the weather. Then came the drift. Not a gradual slope, but a sudden, treacherous mound of snow, hidden beneath the storm's veil. The truck lurched, the tires spinning futilely, and for a heartbeat, the world tilted. He wrestled the wheel, muscles straining, and the rig shuddered back onto what he prayed was the road. His pulse hammered in his throat. One mistake, that's all it would take. One wrong move, and the woods would swallow him whole. No traces, no answers, just another name added to the list of those who vanished into the wild. He should have turned back. He knew it. Every instinct screamed it. But the clock on the dash ticked onward, and somewhere ahead, a delivery waited, a promise made. So he pressed on, the truck groaning in protest. As the storm tightened its grip, the headlights cut feebly through the blizzard, illuminating nothing but endless churning snow. And then, was that a shape in the distance? A break in the trees? Or just the storm playing tricks on a mind unraveling with exhaustion? The question lingered, unanswered, as the wind rose to a shriek and the night deepened around him. The night had long since swallowed the highway whole, and now it was his turn to be consumed. The storm was no longer just a force to battle. It had become a living thing, howling through the pines, like a predator circling its prey. His knuckles, white against the steering wheel, betrayed the terror he refused to name. The truck's headlights carved twin tunnels through the blinding snow, but beyond them, there was only the abyss. And then, the road vanished. A split second, that's all it took. The rear wheels hit black ice, and the rig lurched violently, the trailer fishtailing like a wounded beast. The world dissolved into a symphony of destruction. The screech of metal tearing against asphalt, the groaning protest of the suspension as the cab tilted precariously, the thunderous crack of branches snapping beneath the undercarriage as the truck plunged off the shoulder. His stomach lurched as gravity betrayed him, the seatbelt biting into his chest like a vice. The dashboard erupted in a cascade of sparks, the radio hissing static as if the storm itself had crawled inside the cab. Somewhere in the chaos, the engine roared its final defiant growl before the world went silent, save for the relentless whump-whump of the windshield wipers, still fighting a battle already lost. His mind raced faster than the truck ever could. Brake. Steer into it. Don't lock up. But the commands were drowned out by the primal scream of his instincts. The wheel was a wild thing in his hands, twisting free of his grip as the cab spun. Once, twice, then the sickening crunch of the driver's side, folding like tin foil against a tree. Glass exploded inward, a glittering storm of its own, and the cold rushed in. Not just winter's bite, but something deeper, something ancient. His breath came in ragged gasps, fogging the shattered air as he fumbled for the door handle, only to find it jammed. The truck wasn't just stuck, it was embedded, the front bumper buried in the snowdrift, like a tombstone. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of his own pulse, a frantic drumbeat counting down the seconds. Then, the realization hit him like the storm's fury. No one knows where you are. The CB radio was dead. The road behind him had vanished, and ahead, only the endless hungry dark. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, the metal icy through his gloves. Somewhere out there, the blizzard raged on, indifferent. Somewhere, a family waited. And here, in this frozen coffin of steel and shattered glass, he was already becoming a ghost. What happens next isn't just a question of survival. It's a riddle the woods have kept for decades. And the answer, it's still out there, buried beneath the ice, waiting to be found. The storm had swallowed him whole, and now the world held its breath As the first light of dawn cracked through the iron-gray sky, the search began. Highways that once hummed with the rhythm of 18-wheelers now echoed with the static of police radios and the low growl of search and rescue trucks. They came in waves, state troopers with flashlights cutting through the swirling snow, fellow truckers abandoning their routes to join the hunt, their faces etched with the kind of dread that only those who've stared down the barrel of a blizzard truly understand. This wasn't just a missing man. This was one of their own, vanished into the teeth of a winter that showed no mercy. The dispatch logs from that first week paint a picture of controlled chaos. We've got tire tracks leading off, exit 12, but they disappear about a half-mile in, swallowed by the drift. A deputy's voice crackled over the airwaves, the exhaustion thick in his words. Like the damn road just ended. Helicopters clawed at the sky, their searchlights carving ghostly paths through the pines, but the whiteout was relentless. On the ground, volunteers dragged chains through the underbrush, their breath fogging in the frigid air as they called his name. Jim, Jim, can you hear us? Knowing even then that the storm had long since stolen the sound. His wife, Margaret, clutched a photograph of him in his plaid jacket, her knuckles white. He wouldn't just leave the truck, she whispered to a reporter, her voice raw. Not Jim. That rig was his livelihood. Something went wrong, something bad. Days bled into weeks. The search grid expanded, swallowing up more of the wilderness. But the forest guarded its secrets well. Bloodhounds lost the scent, where the wind had scoured the snow clean. Thermals picked up nothing but the cold, unyielding pulse of the earth. Investigators pored over maps, tracing the last known coordinates with red pens, their fingers lingering over the spots where the terrain turned treacherous. It's like he drove straight into a void, one detective admitted off the record, the frustration gnawing at him. No skid marks, no debris, just gone. The trucking community, tight-knit and superstitious, began to whisper about the old-timers' warnings, the stretches of highway where the trees leaned in too close, where the compass needles spun like drunkards. Some places, an old driver muttered over a diner coffee, gone cold. They don't like giving up their dead. And then, as suddenly as it had ignited, the search began to fade. The news cycles turned. The volunteers returned to their lives. But not everyone let go. Margaret kept his CB radio on his desk, tuned to the channel he always used, as if by some miracle he might break through the static one night. The troopers filed the case under pending, though they all knew what that meant. And deep in the woods, where the pines stood sentinel and the snow never quite melted, the rig waited, untouched, unseen, frozen in time, just as he had left it. Proof that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only endured. So ask yourself, how many others are out there, lost to the storm, to the land, to the cruel indifference of time? And what would you do if the wilderness called your name and then fell silent? Decades slipped by like the slow, silent drift of snowflakes settling over a forgotten world. The highways hummed with the passage of time, the search parties dwindled, and the missing truck driver's face faded from bulletin boards. His story whispering only in the hushed conversations of those who refused to let go. But the wilderness remembers. It holds its secrets close, locked beneath layers of ice and the unyielding grip of winter's breath. And so it was, in the heart of a forest, where the trees stood like sentinels of a long-buried truth, that two hunters would step unwittingly into a moment frozen, not just in time, but in ice. The air was razor-sharp that November morning, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and stole breath away before it could form words. Jake Mercer and his brother Liam moved through the underbrush with the cautious rhythm of men who knew these woods held more than just game. Their boots crunched over frost-laced leaves, the only sound in a world so still it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. The storm from the night before had painted everything in crystalline silence, bending branches beneath the weight of fresh snow, turning the landscape into a glassy maze. They had come for deer tracks, for the promise of a quiet hunt before winter's true fury descended. But the forest had other plans. Then, there it was, a glint, unnatural, out of place, half buried in the frozen creek bed, where the water had long since surrendered to the cold. Liam's breath hitched, his rifle lowering as his eyes locked onto the shape beneath the ice. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't the skewed reflection of a fallen tree. It was metal, curved, rust-streaked, the outline of a wheel well, just visible through the translucent sheet, like a ghost reaching up from the depths. Jake's pulse quickened as he stepped closer, the ice groaning beneath his weight. He knelt, brushing away the snow, and the truth unfolded before them in a slow, creeping horror. The ice wasn't just hiding an object, it was preserving a relic, a truck cab, buried, untouched, as if the world had simply stopped for it. The brothers exchanged a glance, the kind that needed no words. This wasn't just an abandoned rig. This was a tomb, a time capsule of dread. The wind howled through the pines, a mournful chorus to the realization settling over them. Someone had been here, someone had stayed here, and the forest had kept them company in the silence, all these years. Jake's fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone, the cold biting at the screen, the signal barely clinging to life. One bar. Enough. But what do you say when you found something that wasn't meant to be found? When the past reaches out from the ice and pulls you into its story. The hunters didn't know it yet, but they weren't just standing at the edge of a frozen creek. They were standing at the edge of an answer. And answers, once unearthed, demand to be heard. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, a mournful chorus that seemed to whisper warnings across the frozen expanse. The hunters had ventured deeper than usual that morning, drawn by the promise of untouched wilderness, where the snow lay thick and the world felt suspended in time. But as their boots crunched over the brittle ice, something beneath the surface caught their eyes. A shape, unnatural, too angular, too deliberate to be the work of nature alone. The first hunter knelt, brushing away the frost with gloved fingers, his breath shallow as the truth began to crystallize before him. Metal, rust-eaten, but unmistakable. The curve of a fender, the ghostly outline of a cab. Then came the silence, a suffocating pause, as the weight of the discovery pressed down on them. This was no abandoned relic, left to rot in the woods. This was a tomb. The truck was still there, frozen in the ice, like a ship trapped in the Arctic, its windows glazed with decades of frost, its tires half buried in the permafrost. One of them reached out, hesitating, before touching the door handle, as if afraid the past itself might answer. The cold bit back, a reminder that some secrets refused to thaw. The paint, once vibrant, now bore the scars of time, peeling in sorrowful strips, revealing the bare bones of a machine that had carried a man into oblivion. Their voices dropped to hushed tones, thick with disbelief. How long has this been here? Who was he? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as their flashlight beams cut through the gloom, illuminating the cab's interior. A thermos, still resting in the cup holder. A logbook, its pages fused together by ice and time. The steering wheel, positioned as if the driver had just stepped away, for a moment, for a cigarette, for a breath of air, before the storm swallowed him whole. The beauty of the wilderness, so pristine and indifferent, now felt like a cruel joke. Nature had preserved this moment, this snapshot of a life interrupted, with an almost reverent precision. And then, the realization settled over them, like the first snowflake before a blizzard. This wasn't just a truck, it was a grave marker. A man had vanished here, his story erased by the wind and the years, his fate known only to the trees that stood sentinel. The hunters exchanged glances, the kind that carry the weight of something unspoken, respect, maybe, or fear. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, some are meant to haunt. As the first flakes of a new storm began to fall, they stood there, frozen, not by the cold, but by the understanding that they had just pulled back the curtain on a tragedy long buried. And now, the question wasn't just about what happened to him, but about what happens to all of us when the world forgets we were ever here. The road before the storm, before the ice claimed him, before the snow swallowed his rig whole, and the world forgot his name. He was a man who lived between two places, the open road and the weight of his own dreams. They called him Big Jim at the truck stops, not just for his broad shoulders, or the way he could hoist a transmission block like it was nothing, but for the way he carried himself, like a man who still believed in the promise of the next exit. But promises, like the highways he traversed, had a way of stretching thin when the night got long and the bills piled higher than the mile markers. He had started driving in '78, back when the CB radio crackled with more than just weather reports, back when it hummed with the voices of men who called themselves knights of the asphalt, brothers in diesel and distance. Jim bought into that myth hard. The road was freedom, or so he told himself as he signed the papers on his first rig, a used Freightliner with a sleeper cab that smelled like stale coffee and someone else's cigarettes. His wife, Linda, had smiled that day, but her fingers tightened around his when the loan officer slid the contract across the desk. She knew what he didn't yet, that freedom had a price, and it wasn't just the monthly payments. By '83, the myth had worn thin. The economy had turned mean. Fuel prices climbed like vines up a telephone pole, and the routes that used to pay enough for a steak dinner now barely covered the tab at the diner, where the waitresses knew his order by heart: black coffee, eggs over easy, and a side of toast he never finished. Linda's letters, tucked into his glove compartment, smelled faintly of her perfume, a scent that lingered long after the ink had faded. "The kids ask when you're coming home," she wrote in one, her handwriting slanting like she'd been crying. "I tell them soon." But Jim, what soon anymore? He'd read it under the glow of a truck stop neon, the hum of the ice machine drowning out the crack in his voice. He dreamed of a different life then, one where he wasn't one flat tire away from ruin, one where the bank didn't own more of his time than he did. There was a plot of land in Montana, cheap, with a view of the mountains that made his chest ache just thinking about it. He'd circled it in the classifieds, the paper soft from being folded and refolded in his pocket. 5 acres. Well water, needs work. So did he, so did they all. But that night, as he pulled out of Billings with a load of lumber and a forecast calling for snow, he let himself believe it was still possible. The storm was just another hurdle. He'd driven through worse. The CB had been quiet that evening, the static, his only companion, as the flakes began to stick to the windshield. He turned the wipers up, the rhythm steady, hypnotic. Somewhere ahead, the road curved into darkness, and beyond that, maybe a future that didn't taste like exhaust and regret. He reached for the thermos of coffee Linda had packed, still warm. The last thing he remembered was the way the headlights cut through the snow, 2 thin beams, carving a path into the unknown. And then nothing, just the quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when the world decides to hold its breath. Now, decades later, the ice remembers what the world forgot: a man, a rig, a life suspended between what was and what could have been. And as the hunters stand there, breath fogging in the cold, they don't just see a truck. They see the ghost of a dream, frozen in time, waiting to be found. Ask yourself, what would you have done if the road home was just one storm too far? And what dreams of yours are still out there, buried under the snow, waiting for the ice to melt? The wind howled through the skeletal trees, a sound like a warning whispered across time. The hunters stood frozen, not by the cold, but by the weight of what lay before them. There, half swallowed by decades of ice and snow, was the rusted hulk of a truck, its cab still bearing the faded logo of a company long since gone. The air around it seemed to hum with something unspoken, a silence so thick it pressed against their chests. One of them, a man named Cole, with hands roughened by years of tracking game, exhaled sharply. His breath curled in the frigid air, like a ghost trying to escape his lips. This wasn't just an abandoned rig, it was a tomb. And tombs, he knew, were meant to stay undisturbed, yet curiosity is a hunger no man can starve. The others felt it too, the pull of the unknown, the itch to peel back the layers of ice and uncover what the wilderness had kept hidden for so long. But fear coiled in their guts, cold and slick as the black ice beneath their boots. What if the truck wasn't empty? What if the storm that swallowed the driver whole in '83 had left more than just metal behind? The forest around them groaned under the weight of the wind, branches creaking like old bones. Every shadow seemed to shift, every gust of snow a fleeting shape just beyond their vision. The land itself felt alive, watching, waiting. They knelt in the snow, gloves brushing against the frozen door handle. The metal bit back, unyielding. The cold seeped through their layers, gnawing at their fingers, their faces, their resolve. One of them, younger, bolder, pulled out a knife and began chipping at the ice. The sound was obscene, like breaking teeth. The others exchanged glances. They'd come here for deer, not this, not the past, clawing its way back into the light. But some things, once found, refused to be ignored. The sun hung low, bleeding weak light across the clearing. Time was slipping. The storm that had erased one man's existence decades ago now threatened to do the same to them. Stay and risk the mountain's wrath. Leave and carry the weight of the unknown for the rest of their lives. Cole tightened his grip on his rifle, the barrel cold against his palm. He thought of the driver, the man who'd sat in that cab, hands on the wheel, heart full of plans that would never come to pass. Someone's son, someone's father. The realization settled over them like the descending dark. This wasn't just about a truck. It was about a life suspended in ice, a story begging to be finished. And so, with the first stars pricking through the twilight, they made their choice. The knife struck deeper. The ice resisted, then gave way with a crack like a gunshot. The door groaned open, just an inch. Just enough. Inside, the darkness was absolute. A breath of air escaped, stale and thick with the scent of old leather, rust, and something else. Something human. The hunters leaned in, hearts pounding. And for the first time in 30 years, the truck's secrets began to stir. The frost-clad silence of the wilderness held its breath as the hunters and local authorities converged around the frozen relic. A truck entombed in ice, its rusted frame, a ghostly testament to a night in 1983 when time itself seemed to stand still. The air crackled with tension, each step toward the vehicle sending echoes through the brittle snow, as if the land resisted, revealing its secrets. They had come prepared, armed with tools to chip away at the glacial shroud, but nothing could prepare them for what lay beneath. The first strike of the ice axe sent a shudder through the group. The truck's door, sealed shut for decades, groaned under the weight of frozen time. With each careful blow, fragments of ice cascaded like shattered memories, revealing glimpses of faded paint, once vibrant, now dulled by the relentless grip of winter. The authorities moved methodically, their breaths visible in the frigid air, as they worked to pry open the driver's side door. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the driver's final moments. Then, with a final heave, the door gave way, and the interior yawned open, a time capsule of frozen stillness. Inside, the cab was a tomb of preserved details. The steering wheel, still gripped by a layer of ice, bore the faint imprint of hands that had once guided it through the storm. The seat, cracked with age, held the ghostly outline of a body long since vanished. A thermos, still capped, sat in the cup holder, its contents frozen solid, a silent witness to the driver's last attempt at warmth. The dashboard, dusted with frost, displayed gauges frozen mid-reading, as if the truck had been abandoned in an instant. But it was the glove compartment that drew their attention. Locked tight, it resisted their efforts at first, until a final forceful tug sent it flying open. What they found inside would unravel the mystery further. A ledger, its pages brittle with cold, lay atop a stack of yellowed receipts. The ink had bled slightly, as if the words themselves had tried to escape the freezing temperatures. And beneath it all, a single photograph, its edges curled with age, stared back at them, a face they didn't recognize, but one that would soon haunt their thoughts. The realization settled over them like the falling snow. This truck hadn't just preserved metal and paper. It had preserved a story, one that was about to unfold in ways none of them could have imagined. As the wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers of the past, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something far greater than a simple discovery. The truck had been waiting, and now it was finally ready to speak. But would they be ready to hear what it had to say? The moment the rusted door of the truck groaned open, it wasn't just the cold that rushed out. It was the weight of a life suspended in time. Inside, the cabin was a tomb of frozen memories, each object whispering secrets of the man who had vanished into the storm decades before. A thermos, still half full, its contents long since turned to ice, sat on the passenger seat, as if he had just set it down. The dashboard held a faded map, its edges brittle, the route marked in pencil, his last known path before the world swallowed him whole. But it was the personal effects that made the breath catch in the throats of those who found them. Beneath the seat, wrapped in a wool blanket stiff with frost, lay a small wooden box. Inside, a collection of photographs, his family, their smiles frozen in a time before grief. One image showed a young girl, no older than 10, holding a handwritten sign, "Drive safe, Daddy. Love, Emily." The date scrawled on the back, Christmas, 1982. Less than a year later, he would disappear. A leather-bound diary, its pages warped but legible, revealed fragments of his thoughts. The roads are getting worse. Should have turned back, but the load's due tomorrow. Emily's birthday is next week. Gotta make it. The last entry, written in a shaky hand, read simply, "Can't see the road. Just white. God, if you're listening." The rest was blank. The hunters stood in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. One of them, a father himself, traced a finger over the photograph of the little girl, now a woman in her 50s, if she was still out there. The sheriff, a man who had heard the rumors of the missing driver his whole career, exhaled slowly. "We always thought he'd just driven off the edge somewhere. But this was a man who tried." The air in the cabin was thick with the ghost of his struggle, the final moments of a life that had fought against the storm. And then there was the glove compartment. Inside, a single cassette tape, its label smudged but readable. "For Emily's birthday." The tape player, miraculously intact, still had the cassette loaded. No one dared press play, not yet, because some stories aren't just found, they're felt. And this one was still unfolding, its echoes reaching across the decades, demanding to be heard. What does it mean to vanish without a trace? To leave behind a life that keeps moving? Birthdays celebrated without you, holidays marked by your absence. The truck wasn't just metal and ice. It was a reliquary of what could have been. And as the hunters stepped back, letting the authorities take over, one question lingered, heavier than the snow-laden pines above them. How many other stories are still out there, waiting in the quiet places, just beyond the edge of the known? The weight of time and the whisper of the woods' decades had passed since the storm swallowed him whole, since the truck, once a rolling testament to a man's livelihood, became a silent monument to absence. Now, as the hunters stood before it, they bore witness to the slow, relentless work of time and nature, two forces that had conspired to both preserve and erase. The rig was there, yes, but it was no longer just metal and glass. It was a relic, its surface etched with the scars of 30 winters, its bones groaning under the weight of stories no one had heard. The cold had been a merciless curator. The truck's exterior, once a vibrant hue of industrial blue, now wore a patina of rust and frost, its paint blistered and peeling like sunburnt skin. The chrome bumpers, once polished to a mirror's gleam, had dulled into a ghostly silver, their edges softened by the creeping tendrils of oxidation. Yet beneath the ice, where the world had been still and dark, the preservation was eerie. The cab's interior remained a time capsule, untouched, but not unmarked. The vinyl seats, cracked like dried riverbeds, still held the faint impression of a man who had sat there for the last time, unaware his journey would stretch into eternity. The steering wheel, its leather worn smooth by calloused hands, now bore the delicate tracery of frost, as if the very air had tried to claim it. Nature, too, had left its signatures. Moss had crept into the seams of the door frames, stitching the truck into the forest floor, as though the earth itself sought to reclaim what the storm had taken. Inside, the dashboard was a graveyard of fallen leaves and pine needles, carried in by the wind through gaps the years had pried open. The glove compartment, once a repository of maps and receipts, now housed the skeletal remains of insects, their delicate wings preserved like pressed flowers in a forgotten book. Even the scent was different, no longer the sharp tang of diesel and oil, but something older, deeper, the smell of damp wood and iron, of things returning to the earth. And then there were the things time could not erase. The thermos, still wedged into its holder, its stainless steel surface pitted by condensation and age. The CB radio, its dials frozen mid-tune, as if waiting for a voice that would never answer. The logbook, its pages warped but legible, the last entries scrawled in a hand that had long since stilled. These were the echoes of a life interrupted, the fragments that resisted oblivion. They spoke of a man who had laughed, who had cursed the weather, who had hummed along to the static-filled radio, until he didn't quote T. It is here, in this quiet confrontation with the past, that one must pause. The truck is more than steel and glass. It is a question without an answer, a life suspended between memory and the void. The hunters who found it did not just discover a vehicle. They uncovered a threshold, a place where the living and the lost brush against each other for the briefest of moments. And as the ice melts and the rust deepens, as the forest slowly pulls the truck into its embrace, we are left to wonder how many other stories lie buried beneath the snow, waiting for the wind to carry their names back to us. What do we owe to the voices that fade before we can hear them? The woods do not answer. They never do, but they remember. And so, for now, must we dut. The news arrived like a ghost from the past, whispered at first, then undeniable. For nearly 40 years, the family of the missing truck driver had lived in the quiet agony of the unknown, their grief suspended in time, a wound that never quite closed. And then, on a cold autumn afternoon, the call came. Hunters had found his rig, frozen in the woods, preserved in the icy grip of the wilderness, as if time itself had hesitated to move forward. The revelation did not bring relief. It brought something far more complicated, a rush of emotions so raw it felt like the disappearance had happened only yesterday. There was disbelief, of course. How could a truck vanish for decades, only to reappear, as if waiting? The mind struggles to reconcile such things. But beneath the shock lay something deeper, a grief that had been buried, but never truly gone. His daughter, now middle-aged, would later describe the moment she heard the news as feeling the ground give way beneath her. She had been a child when he disappeared, her memories of him fading like old photographs. Now, the past had reached out and grabbed her, demanding she confront it. His wife, who had long since stopped wearing her wedding ring, sat in silence for hours, staring at a picture of him taken the week before he left. The man in the photo was young, smiling, unaware of the storm that would swallow him whole. Questions flooded their minds, each one a jagged edge. Had he suffered? Had he known what was happening as the snow closed in around him? Or had it been quick, merciful? The not knowing had been a kind of torture. But this was different. The truck was there, a tangible piece of the puzzle, yet it offered no immediate answers, only more silence, only the cold, unyielding truth that he had been out there all along, just beyond their reach. And then there was the strange, unsettling sense of closure that wasn't quite closure. The family gathered at the old kitchen table, the same one where they had waited for news all those years ago. They spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance between past and present. His brother, a man of few words, traced the grain of the wood with his fingertips, his voice rough with emotion. "We always thought we'd find him someday," he admitted, "but not like this. Not frozen in time, not as a relic of a life-interrupted dot." The discovery had cracked open something in them, a flood of memories and regrets and love that had nowhere to go. They would have to go to the site, they decided. They would have to see it for themselves, because some questions can only be answered by standing in the place where the story ended, or perhaps where it had only just begun to unfold. And as they prepared for the journey, each of them carried the weight of what they might find and what they might never know. What would you do if the past suddenly reached out and demanded to be acknowledged? How do you mourn a loss that has been both absent and ever-present for decades? The answers aren't simple. But perhaps, in the searching, there is a kind of peace to be found. The moment the frozen rig was reported, the wheels of investigation began to turn, slowly at first, then with a relentless urgency that only a decades-old mystery could demand. Local authorities descended upon the site, their breath visible in the frigid air as they circled the truck, its metal frame still locked in the ice's unyielding grip. Forensic teams moved with deliberate precision, knowing that every chip of ice, every preserved artifact within the cab, could hold the key to unlocking the driver's final hours. But the wilderness had guarded its secrets well, and the passage of time had layered the truth beneath frost and silence. The first challenge was the environment itself. The truck had been swallowed by a remote stretch of forest, accessible only by rugged terrain that resisted modern equipment. Heavy machinery had to be hauled in piece by piece, while investigators battled the elements, howling winds that threatened to erase fresh footprints, and temperatures that risked refreezing any evidence thawed for examination. Then there was the ice. It wasn't just a barrier. It was a preserver, a crypt that had sealed the truck in a moment frozen since 1983. Extracting it without destroying potential clues required a painstaking balance of heat and patience, as teams used specialized tools to melt layers millimeter by millimeter, revealing the cab's interior like an archaeologist uncovering a tomb. Inside, the details emerged with eerie clarity. The driver's logbook lay open on the seat, its pages brittle but legible, the last entry scrawled in hasty handwriting. A note about the storm's intensity, a mention of a shortcut through the woods. The ignition was still in the on position, the fuel gauge hovering just above empty. A thermos, half full of coffee, now reduced to icy sludge, sat in the cup holder, as if he'd set it down only moments before. But the most chilling discovery was the CB radio, its frequency dialed to a local channel, the microphone still clutched in the driver's seat, as though he'd been mid-transmission when something, or someone, interrupted him. Authorities traced the radio's last known signals, following a trail of static and fragmented voices that painted a picture of desperation. Dispatch records from that night revealed a final garbled call. "Can't see the road, trees down." Something's before the transmission cut to dead air. Was it the storm that claimed him? Or had the woods, whispered about in local legend, taken more than just his truck? The questions multiplied as investigators cross-referenced weather reports from 1983, only to find discrepancies, wind speeds that didn't match the damage to nearby trees, temperatures that should have kept the roads passable, yet didn't. Then came the witnesses, or what was left of them. A retired state trooper, now gray-haired and stooped, recalled patrolling that same stretch of highway the night the driver vanished. He spoke of a black sedan, parked just off the shoulder, its engine running, but no one inside. When he'd approached, the car had peeled away, taillights swallowed by the storm. Another lead surfaced from a diner waitress who'd served the driver his last meal. She remembered him talking to a stranger, a man in a dark coat who'd asked too many questions about his route. But the stranger had paid in cash, left no name, and vanished like the snowflakes melting on the diner's windowsill. Piece by piece, the investigation inched toward a truth that felt just out of reach. The truck's black box, if it even had one, was missing, ripped from its mounting, as if someone had wanted to silence its data forever. The driver's wallet was found empty, his ID and photos gone, but a single creased photograph remained tucked behind the sun visor. A young girl, her smile frozen in time, her eyes the same shade of blue as the driver's. Was she his daughter? A clue, or a final, heartbreaking memento, left behind in the rush of fear? The deeper they dug, the more the case resisted closure. Fingerprints lifted from the door handle didn't match any in the system. The truck's tires showed signs of a struggle, deep grooves in the ice, as if it had been forced off the path. And then there was the boot print, half buried near the driver's side, too large to be his. The tread pattern, long discontinued. Someone else had been there, someone who didn't want to be found. Now, as the evidence sits under laboratory lights, and the driver's family waits with bated breath, one question lingers like the frost on the windshield. What or who was he running from that night? The answer is close, buried in the ice, and the memories of a town that has carried this secret for far too long. But some truths, once thawed, refuse to stay hidden, and this one is about to surface. The moment the news broke, it wasn't just the authorities who stirred, it was the land itself, as if the earth had been holding its breath for 40 years. The discovery of the frozen rig didn't just resurface a truck, it unearthed a ghost, and in a place where winters carved stories into the bones of the mountains, the community began to whisper. They spoke of the driver, a man whose name had faded into the kind of legend that lingers in the back of diners, where coffee cups sit half full and the jukebox hums forgotten tunes. Some called him Old Jack, though few could say for certain if that was ever his name. Others remembered him only as the quiet man who'd nod at the counter, leave a dollar tip, and vanish into the storm before the pie was even cold. Theories spread like wildfire through the hollows and valleys, each one more haunting than the last. The elders at the general store swore the woods had always been wrong that winter, how the wind carried voices when no one was there, how the trees seemed to lean in closer when you passed. A retired logger, his hands still rough as bark, claimed he'd seen headlights cutting through the blizzard that night, moving against the wind, as if something or someone had been guiding the truck deeper into the pines. His wife, a woman who'd buried 2 brothers in those same woods, crossed herself and said only, "Some roads ain't meant to be found." Then there were the younger ones, the ones who'd never known the driver, but felt his absence like a draft in an old house. They spun tales of a phantom rig, still rolling through the worst storms, its engine a low growl beneath the howling wind. Teenagers dared each other to stand at the edge of the tree line at midnight, swearing they'd see the faint glow of brake lights, where the ice never quite melted. The discovery didn't just answer questions, it birthed new ones, darker and more tangled. Was it the storm that took him, or had the woods, hungry and patient, claimed another soul the way they always did? The sheriff's office tried to tamp down the rumors, but in a place where the past isn't dead, it's just waiting. Facts had a way of bending. The driver's logbook, found frozen to the dashboard, held entries that didn't match any known route. The last one, scrawled in a hand that trembled with cold or fear, read simply, "They're in the trees." No one could say who they were. But in the weeks that followed, more than one hunter came back early, pale-faced and tight-lipped, their rifles untouched. The diner's owner, a woman who'd poured coffee for the driver 100 times, set a fresh cup at his usual stool every morning. Just in case, she'd mutter, though she wouldn't meet your eyes. The story became a mirror. The old saw their own losses in it. The husbands who never came home from the mines. The children swallowed by the river. The young saw a warning, a reminder that the wild places didn't care how fast your engine ran or how bright your headlights shone. And when the wind picked up at dusk, carrying the scent of pine and something older, even the skeptics paused, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some are meant to be carried, like the weight of a ghost riding shotgun on a long, dark road. So tell me, when the snow falls thick enough to muffle the world, and the trees stand like silent witnesses, what do you think he saw in those last moments? And more importantly, what do you think saw him? The weight of what lies beneath. The moment the hunters first laid eyes on the frozen rig, something shifted, not just in the ice, but in them. It wasn't just the eerie stillness of the truck, preserved like a relic in the heart of the wilderness, or the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees as if carrying a warning. It was the realization that time, no matter how relentless, could be halted, and in that suspension, the past wasn't just remembered, it was alive. For Jake, the eldest of the group, the discovery clawed at something deep and unresolved. He had buried his own father years ago, a man who had vanished into the woods one winter, never to return. The authorities called it an accident. The community called it fate. But standing there, staring at the truck's rusted grill, Jake's hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the ghost of a question he'd never let himself ask. What if he didn't want to be found? The ice beneath his boots groaned, as if the earth itself was straining under the weight of unspoken truths. That night, by the fire, he didn't speak. He just stared into the flames, seeing not the dancing embers, but the headlights of a truck swallowed by a storm decades ago. Then there was Sarah, the wildlife biologist, who had joined the search out of professional curiosity. She had spent her career tracking patterns, solving puzzles written in animal tracks and weather cycles. But this was different. The truck wasn't just an artifact. It was a void, a gap in the narrative of a life that had simply stopped. As she ran her fingers over the frozen door handle, she thought of her own brother, who had left for a cross-country drive years ago and never called again. The authorities had labeled him a runaway. Her family called him reckless. But in that moment, she wondered if the truth was far simpler, far crueler. What if the road just took him? The thought settled in her chest like a stone. Even the investigators, hardened by years of solving the unsolvable, weren't immune. Detective Cole, a man who prided himself on detachment, found himself waking in the dead of night, his mind replaying the driver's last known transmission. "I can't see the road anymore." The words echoed in the silence of his apartment, twisting into something personal. He had spent his life chasing answers, believing that closure was a right, not a privilege. But as he sat in his car outside the morgue, watching the snow fall in slow, deliberate flakes, he questioned that belief for the first time. What if some questions weren't meant to be answered? What if the real horror wasn't the unknown, but the moment you realized you'd been looking in the wrong place all along? The rig became more than a case. It became a mirror. In its frozen silence, each of them saw their own fears reflected back. Fears of being forgotten, of leaving no trace, of being just another name whispered in passing. And yet, there was something else too, a strange, fragile hope. Because if time could preserve a truck for decades, maybe it could preserve them, their stories, their regrets, their unspoken love for those they'd lost. Maybe the past wasn't just a place of endings, but of beginnings, too. So they kept digging, not just into the ice, but into themselves. And with every layer they uncovered, they understood something profound. The search for the driver wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about confronting the shadows they'd carried for years, the ones that whispered in the dead of night. What if it had been you? And perhaps, in the end, that was the real discovery, not what happened to the man in the truck, but what his absence had awakened in those who found him. The question now wasn't just where did he go, but where do we go from here? And that, more than any frozen relic, was the thing that would haunt them long after the ice melted. The frost still clings to the air as the investigators step closer, their breaths visible in the frigid silence, a silence so thick it feels like the woods themselves are holding their breath. Beneath the ice, the truck's rusted frame emerges like a ghost from another time, its once vibrant blue paint now dulled by decades of snow and secrecy. The door hangs ajar, frozen mid-swing, as if the driver had stepped out for just a moment and never returned. But what lies inside is not the emptiness one might expect. No, this is where the story darkens, where the fragments of a life interrupted begin to whisper their secrets. A thermos, still half full of coffee now turned to sludge, sits on the passenger seat, its metal surface pitted with corrosion. The logbook lies open, the last entry scrawled in hurried, shaky handwriting. Storm's worse than they said. Can't see 5 feet ahead. If this doesn't clear, I'm pulling over till dawn. The ink blurs at the edges, as if the pen had trembled or the paper had been damp when it was written. Then there's the CB radio, its wires chewed through by time or teeth. No one knows which. Its last transmission logged at 2:17 a.m., a staticky plea cut short. Anyone read me? I think I'm... And then nothing. The tape hisses with empty air. A void where an answer should have been. Witnesses from the old diner along Route 12 remember him that night. The waitress, now gray-haired and frail, still recalls the way he'd lingered over his pie, staring out the window at the swirling snow. He wasn't scared, she murmurs, her voice cracking, just quiet, like he already knew something we didn't. The short-order cook, a man who'd seen countless truckers come and go, swears the driver had mentioned a shortcut, one the locals avoided. Old logging road, he'd said. Gets real bad real fast, but it'll shave 2 hours off if the weather holds. It didn't quote T. The coroner's report would later note the absence of struggle. The way the driver's coat was found neatly draped over the seat, his boots aligned beneath the dashboard, as if he'd stepped out barefoot into the storm. No signs of foul play, no signs of panic, just an ending that wasn't. The hunters who found the rig speak of a sensation they can't shake, the feeling of being watched as they stood there, the wind howling through the pines like a chorus of voices. One of them, a man who'd spent his life tracking deer through these woods, admits he hasn't slept through the night since. It's like he's still there, he confesses, his hands clenched around a mug of long cold coffee, waiting for someone to figure out what happened. And perhaps that's the most haunting truth of all. The truck didn't just vanish into the snow. It was preserved, suspended in time like an insect in amber. The storm that night wasn't just weather, it was a threshold, a point of no return. The logs show no mechanical failure. The maps reveal no wrong turns. So where does that leave us? With the chilling possibility that some choices don't lead to destinations, but to erasure, that the road doesn't always take you home. Sometimes it takes you somewhere else entirely. Now, as the last light fades through the trees, casting long shadows over the ice-encased relic, one question lingers, heavier than the silence. What do you do when the answer is worse than the mystery? When the only thing left to find is the thing you can't bear to know? And so, beneath the weight of decades, the frozen relic of a life interrupted emerges, not just as steel and rust, but as a silent testament to the night the world forgot about Harold Thompson. The hunters who stumbled upon his rig, half swallowed by the ice, didn't just find a truck, they unearthed a time capsule of unspoken goodbyes, a vehicle forever stalled between departure and arrival. The cab, still sealed against the elements, held the remnants of a man who had once hummed along to the radio, who had adjusted his mirrors one last time before the storm swallowed him whole. A thermos, cold to the touch, for 40 years, sat beside a logbook with entries that stopped mid-sentence, as if the words themselves had frozen in the act of being written. The keys, still in the ignition, waited for a hand that would never return to turn them. What lingers now isn't just the mystery of how he vanished, but the haunting symmetry of his discovery, a man who spent his life on the road only to become a permanent fixture of the wilderness he once traversed. The truck, once a symbol of motion and purpose, now stands as a monument to the fragile thread between here and gone. His family, who had long since learned to live with the hollow echo of his absence, were handed not closure, but a new kind of grief, the tangible proof of what they had only dared to imagine. His daughter, now gray-haired, traced her fingers over the dashboard where his gloves had last rested, and for the first time in decades, she didn't have to wonder if he had suffered. The ice had been kind in that way, preserving not just the truck, but the quiet dignity of his final moments. Yet the wilderness remembers what time forgets. The pines that now grow tall around the clearing were mere saplings when Harold's headlights cut through the snow for the last time. The creek that once roared with meltwater now whispers against the truck's undercarriage, as if murmuring secrets to anyone who dares to listen. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all, that the land we move through carries the imprints of lives we'll never know, stories pressed into the earth like footprints in fresh snow. Harold's rig isn't just a relic, it's a reminder that every stretch of highway, every forgotten trail, is a potential graveyard of dreams deferred. So what do we owe to the Harold Thompsons of the world, the ones who slip through the cracks of memory until fate, or chance, or the stubborn curiosity of strangers drags them back into the light? Maybe it's more than just a pause for reflection. Maybe it's a vow to look closer at the landscapes we rush through, to acknowledge that the ghosts of the past aren't just in the things we find, but in the spaces we choose to ignore. The next time you pass a weathered rest stop, or a stretch of road where the trees press in too close, ask yourself, what stories are waiting here, frozen in time? Because Harold's truck isn't just his. It belongs to every traveler who's ever vanished into the dark, to every family who stared at an empty chair at the dinner table, to every hunter-hiker or lost soul who's wondered what the woods might be hiding. And if we listen hard enough, we might hear the faint hum of an engine that never quite made it home.